Professor, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your accomplishments, and your book, The French Intifada.
Well, I've written several books on France, and the French Intifada, the long war between France and its Arabs, is kind of a central part of that, but part of a series of related themes. Probably the best way into it is to give a little bit of autobiography, and that is that I arrived in France in 1984 to study, and I arrived in Lyon, and I'd been in North Africa that year as well. And on arrival in Lyon, I realized that I was in a world that I really didn't understand. And this wasn't because it was the world of French literature and French culture and history that I kind of had been studying anyway. It was to do with this new form of kind of revolt or insurrection or violence, whatever you want to call it, which was taking place in Lyon that year, which was coming from the banlieue of Vaux-en-Velin and Vénissieux. And on a personal level, I was a young student at the university there, and this was happening all around me. And this kind of new kind of violence, I didn't really understand it at all, mainly because I didn't understand French colonial history enough, and I didn't understand the fact that the violence, a lot of it was coming from the Arab North African population of Lyon against the government. And I would add to that the French government didn't understand that at the time as well. They called these the riots urban riots, which was kind of a marker of how much they really didn't understand what was going on. So spin forward to 2000. I'm now a university professor, University of Wales, but I'm studying the Maghreb. I'm interested in the Maghreb. And shortly after 9/11, I went to Casablanca. And it was in Casablanca that I had the idea for the book, The French Intifada, which dated back originally to the 1980s, obviously, but it was to do with a relationship I didn't understand. What was the relationship between France and the Arab world, and more particularly the Arab world of North Africa, which France had colonized? Now, the title of the book came under attack for two reasons. Some people thought the French Intifada was too sensationalist or melodramatic, which the jury's out on that one. I think it's accurate enough. But the business of France and its Arabs, a lot of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist critics pointed out, these people, they don't belong to France, they're not owned by France. But the whole point was, I might have put it in inverted commas, the ambiguous nature of the relationship between North Africa and France, and in particular the relationship between Algeria and France. So in terms of accomplishments, I've written several books on France. It's ongoing. I'm currently writing a new book to be published next year called France in Fragments. And in a way, a lot of my work has been looking at the past 40 years, how historically France has shifted from being one form of republic to, well, a form of republic that I would say is actually splintering and under threat. And my own story in France is a kind of eyewitness account of that process, I think.
So when you talk about France as a republic, I mean, you mentioned in your book, French Intifada, that France, like the United States, is founded on an idea. I don't fully agree with that. I mean, I think, the United States of America was founded with a document, and I don't think that's quite true with France, which has gone through various permutations. And maybe the French Revolution had, certain documentation, but otherwise, most of the countries of Europe are kind of hereditary in a sense. They have a people and ethnicity, and I assume France is named for the Franks and Gauls or whatever. But there is clearly a French sensibility. I was in France not too long ago, just a couple of months ago, and I spent almost a fortnight there and traveled around a fair bit. And I speak a decent bit of French myself, and had some immersion, spoke with people, and blah blah blah. But there's clearly a French sensibility, and I think it's a mixture of the French Revolution and kind of the Napoleonic counter-revolution, if you want to call it that, or restoration. and then plays out in modern era. I mean, the French towns themselves look different from anywhere else. The trees are sculpted. Not that it matters, but the kind of that square box nature of the trees. It's a sense of order. The streets. We all think of as French, but I think it's I learned then it was kind of a 19th century formulation of Haussmann and kind of I forget which Napoleon it was. But so here's the question, I guess. What is the difference in the sense of French Republic from whatever preconception or earlier conception you have of it to today, and how is it being played out, and why does that matter?
Well, I'll just pick you up on a bit about the order and sensibility and if you like, the Frenchness of France. There is a Frenchness to France. I don't think it's necessarily ethnic. There are lots of different ethnic groups in France, and there always have been, from Basques and Britons and Normans and and so on. But you are right about this business about a sense of order. And my theory is, and I think it holds water to some extent, is the difference between the Anglo-Saxon world, the Anglo-American world, if you like, and the French world, or the French civilization, as the French would think of themselves, is the difference between a classical country and a romantic country. And what I mean by that is that France is a country that has modeled itself essentially on Rome, on antiquity, on the myths of Rome, of order and civilization, rigor, all of these things that lead us to understand Frenchness as a kind of Cartesian way of thinking that applies right down to things like gardening. The British and American sensibility, I think, is more romantic in the sense it's much more messy. It's much more based on the subjective, and that's the key difference. The order in France is about the objectivity. It's about the order of the Champs-Élysées. It's about the Haussmann buildings. It's about geometric lines which organize cities. Where if you look at a city like London, for example, there's no real planning to London. It just kind of erupted and evolved organically for good or bad. But there are no big straight lines. There's no great sort of, if you like, overarching plan. And I think that's one of the things that I think sort of defines Frenchness for me, as that sort of preamble, is that sort of, if you like, the intellectualism, it comes from ideas, the theory translated into practice. Now, the Republic is an idea. It was born out of violence. It was born out of terror. It was probably born out of necessity to some extent as well. But I remember after the Charlie Hebdo killings in January 2015, I went down to the march in Bastille. And after a long time in France, for the first time, I thought, God, I'm really starting to understand the DNA of these people, which was all about liberté, égalité, fraternité, and the Republican idea of a universal suffrage and the universalism of the ideas of freedom, equality, and brotherhood, which are constantly under test, which are constantly being challenged, and which are being challenged now very severely in the 21st century. And out of that idea, let's not forget, the first pillar of the French Constitution is the phrase La République indivisible, the indivisible republic. And that, to me, ties in what I've just said about Frenchness, about the idea of order, intellectual rigor. But so that idea of the indivisible republic is an Enlightenment idea, which I think is coming under severe threat in the 21st century. I know that's not where the question was going, but that's how I think of it.
No, we can go. So it's under threat by whom and how?
Well, it's under threat from various forces. One of the major issues here, which is obviously a major issue across Europe, and which is taboo on the right, no, more on the left than on the right, is immigration. So, I don't know why immigration is often seen as talking about immigration is necessarily a right-wing issue, because it's fundamentally changed the demographics and the economics and the social structure of French society. Now, you can argue whether that's for good or bad, but one of the things that immigration has done is challenge the ability of the Republic to absorb and assimilate forces or populations from outside. So that's one of the major forces which has been placed in the Republic under strain. Another one, I think, is the disintegration of a robust political culture in France. As you know, at the moment, the country is in chaos. Now, France has never always been a particularly stable country at the best of times, and there's always been a kind of civil war between the right and left since the revolution. Should the revolution really have happened in some ways, some people would argue. But the confluence of these issues, mass immigration, and the difficulty of absorbing and assimilating those populations, and the kind of internal collapse of a robust political culture have brought us, I think, to a very, I'm trying not to be hyperbolic here, dangerous, people say things, I don't know, brought us to a kind of unprecedented position, I'd say that.
Well, I don't really want to do the recent 2 rounds of elections just yet. I'd really like to kind of step back and think about the context and backdrop of your book. And the French Intifada obviously has an Arabic term there, and the question would be why? What was the great adventure in Algeria, and how is it played out? What is it that the immigrants from Algeria and the Maghreb generally want in France, and historically, maybe back in the 50s and 60s, or their migrations, and what do the younger ones want, the ones who might be, polygenerationally, quote unquote, French, but not necessarily culturally French. What's the identity now, and does this come down to, I suppose to make put the answer in advance of the question is, does this come down to kind of the Crusades in reverse?
Well, I'll start at the beginning of the relationship between France and Algeria, which is very unusual, and I think we have to understand the unusual nature of that relationship before we say anything else about identity and politics. Now, what was unusual about it was the French conquest of Algeria, which began in 1830, in a series of military maneuvers, as much as anything else, brought Algeria directly into France. And after 1870 in particular, there was a wave of emigrants to Algeria from Alsace, amongst other places. They came from Sardinia, Malta, Spain, Italy, and so on. But French immigrants, a lot of them came from Alsace. And technically, Algeria at this point was made into a département of France. So it was actually part of France, as much as part of France as Alsace, Lorraine had been previously. Now, this created 2 issues, one of which was legal, about the nature of French citizenship, and which left many, the Muslim population of Algeria kind of in a double bind about whether they could or could not belong to France. That was a difficulty. But it also, as well, over a longer period of time, created what I think is a very complex family relationship between France and Algeria. So it's not just the straightforward question of the colonizer and the colonized, which is the classical model for a colonial situation. Both countries kind of have a kind of emotional complicity with each other. And that comes from whether they like it or not, the mixed language, the mixed culture, and a kind of, I would actually use a word like love for each other. In fact, I think I call the big section in Algeria in the French Intifada the prisoner of love, the prisoners of love, after a book by Jean Genet, Captive Amoureux. And, I make the point that, Algerians often feel that France doesn't love them, that they're mal aimés, and, unrequited love hurts really hard. But I'd make a further point that to understand even contemporary terrorism, for example, these days, and the real hatred and the raw hatred that can go on between the two countries, as well as the raw love. You have to understand that this is a complex relationship that psychoanalysis gets nearer to than politics sometimes. So, bringing us up to identity, there have been several waves of immigration to France from Algeria. Through the 50s and 60s, it was mainly to do with employment. And, Algerians who emigrated to France were grateful to find work in factories, send money back, the classical kind of Gastarbeiter kind of model. But then the Algerian War changed all of that, and you had two populations, Muslim populations, from Algeria in coming to France. One of which had been, the population that had actually been on the winning side, the FLN, who had won independence. But it came to France for economic reasons, and found that they had a kind of they had a kind of divided duty, of a divided sense of identity and responsibility. Often forgotten were the population, of very substantial population of what were called acquis. And these were the Algerians the Muslims who'd fought on the side of the French during the Algerian War of Independence. And the acquis they were massacred in Algeria. De Gaulle famously, when one of the acquis representatives in 1962 said to de Gaulle, he said, "We are going to suffer." And de Gaulle replied to him, "Monsieur, you are going to suffer." And they were massacred in the most horrible, brutal ways. Their bodies were fed to dogs. They were stoned to death. All of this kind of thing. It was terrible. And even now, the descendants of the acquis and the Algerian, if you like, mainstream population of France, do not communicate each other. They hate each other. Even recently, the footballer Kylian Mbappé, who's playing for France tonight against Spain, the leading French goal scorer, has been called an acquis by rappers in the banlieue because he voted in a French election and therefore was a traitor to Algeria and a collaborator with France. I interviewed several years ago Zinedine Zidane about this. His father had been called an acquis. And one of the worst moments in Zidane's career, he told me this in Madrid, was the match in 2001 between France and Algeria, which was abandoned when Algerian fans from Paris invaded the pitch and hounded Zidane off the pitch with chants of "Zidane acquis, Zidane acquis." So already we haven't even got below the surface, but within Algerian identities in France, there are lots of different layers of complexity and antipathy as well. I mean, I haven't even started talking about the Kabyles, the Berbers, and their dislike of Arab culture and their own particular Maliki form of Islam, which is actually quite tolerant, superstitious, and so on, and which has been at odds with the urban Islamism that has risen in Algeria over the past 3 or 4 decades. That's complex enough, I think, isn't it?
Yeah. There's also the subgroups. I mean, I think you have like 7 subgroups. I hate that. It's almost unavoidable, this colonizer dichotomy, when every place on Earth has been, quote unquote, colonized, I suppose, by waves of people. Algeria wasn't, there's no necessarily thing Algerian, 500 years ago, whatever, or maybe even a few hundred years ago, if in fact now, they're tribes, and the Berbers might be indigenous. The Arabs, the reason they're speaking Arabic as far afield as Morocco and West Africa is that those places were colonized by Arabs, I assume, and then the Turks kind of took up the mantle of, as the Muslim caliphate after. I guess the Arabs did not, and so I guess when France invaded, there was no Algeria per se. I think it was a colony of the Ottoman Empire, and I'm going to miss out. I'm not going to be as good at all the terminology as you, but there was a hierarchy there at the time where the Turks were on top, and then there were all these other various tribes and mixtures. It reminds me a little bit of more kind of modern day South Africa, where the coloreds. I think there's a term you have there. I can't Chaluchi or something. Were kind of like the mix of Turks and local people, Berbers, and they you know, people were not supposed to have misogyny. They did. And then there was, you know, there was a literally lingua franca, which I guess refers to some version of French itself. And you talk about Adencia. I'd like to maybe just give a little coloration of that kind of, you know, mixture and what it is to be colonized, I guess. And then what is happening now, I think a lot of things are falling under the umbrella of just Salafist Islamism, you know, as the strong horse in the current ride.
Well, you know, it's very interesting what you say about the colonial history of Algeria and other countries as well. I mean, before the French invaded, Algeria didn't really exist at all. I think that the term Algeria was first used, if I'm correct, sometime in the 17th century or 18th century by a French diplomat. I need to check that. But as it wasn't a country, it wasn't a nation, it was a territory, as you say. It was possession of the Ottoman Empire, and it was a patchwork of tribes and clans and loyalties. So what you've got in the 19th century when the French invade is, if you like, a kind of utopianism on the part of the French as much as anything else. The belief that they could have, you know, turn the desert into a garden, and that they would create what was called the New America of the time. That you know, that they were following the American model and turning this raw, untilled land into something that you know, that looked like a European state and had the apparatus of a European nation. And the apparatus that was put in place in Algeria in the 19th century was an apparatus that was put in place at the same time that the nation state became important in Europe. So, you know, it's no accident that nationalism really begins in the 19th century in Europe in the modern sense, and that this nationalism transfers itself to Algeria. So when we look at the origins of the Algerian War and the Algerian War of Independence, it's not as straightforward as a revolt against colonizers. It's also a kind of, there are communists on the Algerian side, there are young intellectuals. Essentially, it's dreamt of as a bourgeois stroke working class, petit bourgeois stroke working class insurrection. It's nothing to do with Islam. It's to do with these young Algerian intellectuals claiming a sense. It becomes something else later on, but claiming their space within a European space, effectively.
Well, I mean, I'm sorry to step on your toes there.
Yeah, sure.
But ditto the Irani revolution, and a lot of other you know, revolutions that happened. They have this kind of working class sensibility. You know, there was like, I forget the name of the government that preceded the Leninists, but there was that little, you know, the Romanovs were overturned, and there was kind of a you know, mini democracy for a mini length of time. Ditto in Iran, and then there's kind of a, you know, the swell of power, you know, takes away those, you know, kind of working class small d democratic sensibilities. I don't think that's quite happened in Algeria. I mean, it didn't happen right away. I think they wound up with kind of like the, you know, socialist heaven of a sort. But they've had their various other, you know, internal strife and mini revolutions. And I guess there was kind of an Islamic takeover in the 90s, which was similar to, you know, Egypt's you know, takedown of the Muslim Brotherhood more recently. Kind of there's this sway that happens throughout, I guess, northern Africa. With the Arab countries, where they can be, you know, somewhat brutal to their own Islamists, but that doesn't really happen in Europe. So as far as the question goes, I don't know if you want to address any of those concepts or steer me correct on any of those things, but you know, did you know, what was the Algerian, you know, who won? You know, in Vietnam, you know, another French territory. You know, the North Vietnamese won over the South, but they instilled, you know, maybe something that wasn't, you know, better as a regime. How did Algeria fare? And does, you know, what was the FLN? And you know, what are their principles then? Now, how does it carry it over in Algeria? And what kind of I mean, does Algeria matter for as far as the French Intifada aspects and kind of what's happening in France?
Let's answer the question directly. Who won? Is Algeria a happy country? No, it's a very unhappy country now in the 21st century. It's come through, a period of awful misery in the 1990s. But I wouldn't say it's entirely recovered from all of that. Algerians want to get out of Algeria, a lot of them, as much as they can. It's not a happy country. So who won? Who made the revolution? Who brought Algerians to a better future? I'm not sure that's I'm not sure that's where we are. Second part of the question. What was the second part of the question about where we are now with in terms of the relationship to France? Is that it?
Well, does Algeria's status matter to France, or does it matter to the Algerians in France? And has the problem of all these kind of aggressions and tribal aspects that was taking place in Algeria, has it just transmuted into France proper? Kind of the inverse. If France saw Algeria as its French colony, and it was a piece of French that says immutable, although it was mutable as Alsace-Lorraine, which has been mutable over the centuries, one way or another, but has it all inverted, to kind of a different, more, say, metaphysical or existential problem of Islam versus Christianity? And does Algeria even matter anymore to the problems that have, in a sense, metastasized into France itself?
I think Algeria matters enormously. It matters diplomatically, it matters in terms of trade, and it matters in terms of, probably most of all, important, still important at the moment, in terms of military strategy, and by that I mean in terms of counterterrorism. Because in some ways the Algerian war is not over. The Islamists of the 1990s declared that France was still the enemy, and that France, through the FLN government at that time, was operating a kind of proxy operation in some way in Algeria. In other words, as well, that the nationalism of the FLN and so on was a European invention, and that the real source of Algerian authenticity for the Islamists, for a group like the FIS, was the return to the source, the return to Islam. And that's where you hit on probably the nub of the question I think you're going towards, is the collision between Islam and the Judeo-Christian tradition of Europe. Now, at a more sort of granular level, as we might say, what happened during the 1990s, and it's still ongoing in a kind of muted way, was that the Algerian civil war of the 1990s was exported to France. And it was exported in the most literal way, in terms of shootouts, in terms of the FIS organising themselves around areas like Barbès, around plans to sort of bomb the Eiffel Tower, the terrorism that took place between France and Algiers at the time. So all of that was kind of like, I tend to see it as a sort of runoff of 1962 and après, and afterwards. The larger question, which is difficult to answer, but needs to be answered, is the civilizational one. That's the big question. Can Europe, can France, can a country like France, which incarnates the European Enlightenment, absorb and assimilate a population of which a substantial part find themselves at odds with that civilization? And that's the nub of what the huge question here. And I think this is something that, particularly on the left, and there's no reason why people should do this, people shy away from it. I identify as someone on the left, by the way, kind of. There's no reason why people should shy away from that issue. But there's no easy answer to it either. And I think it takes a lot of courage, particularly if you're European and on the left, to say, actually, we do have a problem here. This isn't going to be solved by diversity and soft soaping people and actually fundamentally misunderstanding what Islam is. And I'm going to say here that as a Christian myself, Catholic, I'm fascinated by Islam. I'm fascinated by its history, its art, its philosophy. But to be fascinated by Islam, you also need to grasp that you're dealing with something that, has a lot of difficulties that escape the European mind, or which are beyond the European mind. And if you look at someone like Edward Said, his book Orientalism, a book which I dislike intensely, Said, I think is a kind of racist in a way, because he tends to paint Europeans and European thinkers as kind of dumb or vampiric or driven by a mixture of stupidity and malevolence. And I'm not sure that's true. I think a lot of it is a quest to understand something that is very difficult to understand. But one thing that we can understand about Islam, whether we call it, in inverted commas, moderate, or whether we call it, in inverted commas, radical, is that like communism, for example, it's a political religion. It's a political religion, which is a totality. It explains everything about human existence. And it explains everything about human existence. And that is just as much at odds with the neoclassical ideas of the Enlightenment as communism was.
Yeah.
And is.
Yeah. I think there's a movie it's about East Germany. I think it's called The Lives of Others.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
You familiar with that? I always get the title wrong because it's such a bland title for such a charged movie. It reminds me a little bit of the series Chernobyl, which is, I guess, recently voted as one of the top 10 TV shows of all time, or TV series. A small one. But in both cases, we'll stick to The Lives of Others, or in communism in general. Back in the 1980s, for unknown reasons, I took my girlfriend, now my wife, on a trip, and we were on bicycle through East Europe, and it was before the wall fell, and so we traveled through Hungary, what was then Czechoslovakia, and into East Berlin, and then Yugoslavia. But they couldn't hear of anything outside, and this was not a bug. This was a feature, because in order to have the socialist paradise, you couldn't understand and know that there was something like a few meters away, in the case of Berlin, a few hundred meters away, that was something substantially better based on different principles, if you were going to be taught this. And so there had to be a fundamental, not just a lack of curiosity, but a closing of the mind to anything else that might exist that would be preferable. So in order for you to put up with all the hardships that's working towards this great workers' paradise, you had to be unaware that the workers, not that far away, were doing just so much better. They had washing machines. They might have, things that, are material, but their lives were better. They had more fun. They had more happiness. They had bigger, better families. They were able to travel. They had liberty. And I think I saw this term recently, which seems reasonable. This, it's kind of an amalgam of the crescent and the hammer and sickle. And so the crescent becomes the sickle part, and it's Islamianism, as a form of communism. That in both cases you require the totality of somebody's mind. You can't have any differing principles, and so just the nut of this would be competition versus versus siloing versus solidarity. And so this concept that you are absolutely right and there's nothing else to be discussed doesn't allow for any competition. The Enlightenment, in a sense, brought about, I'm not an expert in this as much as you perhaps, but I think the concept is to have the church, but have the church step back from the public square enough that you can have free market, you can have exchange of ideas, exchange of goods, and you can work towards a more robust civilization. The reason Europe's on top and became a colonial power in the more recent centuries is that they profited not by their great natural resources or by their conquerings, but because of basically trade, ideas, and being able to make a more workable society faster. I mean, in the Arab world, insofar as there are cell phones and cars and whatnot, none of them were invented there. And And I think Saudi Arabia kind of gets that they're trying to import universities and import thinkers and so forth. But a friend of mine was pointing out that throughout, I think, the Arab world entire, there is no, you can't get a PhD in physics. And this is an incredible thing, even today. I'd have to fact check that, so a little asterisk there. But it seems to me that it is not just a clash of civilizations, but it's between one that basically says shut up to everything else, and one that is more admitting, and the one that admits can be manipulated. Let's say, is there a question there? Post 9/11, we have the Patriot Act here. We had Islamic terror writ large, and some people felt that the Bill of Rights and our freedoms were should not admit to having should not be a death pact. It should not be, and so the question is, open immigration, allowing of ideas that are in a sense seditious or treasonous to the concept of the French Republic. How does that carry on? We see it, with what's going on in the streets. To quote unquote free Palestine, which has kind of been taken up by the left as a proxy. I'm not sure how much they care about Gaza versus Aleppo, or when the Israelis bomb Rafah versus the Egyptians bombing it, I think 12 years ago. Since you are kind of more left affinity, where does this all go to, and what is the left choosing in its kind of, I guess, mirror image of the right in France?
Well, I think the European left, to a large extent, has been conned, or is too weak to realise that it's been conned. What I mean by that, let's give you a very specific example. The business about laïcité in France.
Yeah.
The business about not wearing the veil in places where the Republic.
Yeah, so we would say lay, kind of like.
Yeah. So this is introduced at the end of the 19th century to stem the power of the Catholic Church. So this is something that comes from the 1789, and it's introduced into the 19th century, so that the church cannot control French life, culturally, morally, politically, in that way. That makes sense if you're a good left-wing Republican. Let's spin forward to 21st century France. You find the left, many elements of it, arguing against laïcité, arguing that the veil should be worn, that the abaya should be worn in schools, and so on. Now, there's a weakness on the left, and I've heard people say this as well. Well, it's only a piece of cloth. It's only a piece of cloth. It's not innocent. It's a symbol. It's a political symbol. And what that symbol is saying is that we have this set of beliefs. You have that set of beliefs. This is our symbol that we will not negotiate with your beliefs. We will not accommodate ourselves to your universalism. Your universalism doesn't match us. We are different. And it's a little, but big collision. And I think it goes back to what you're saying before, I don't know. But it's certainly, it's a contradiction that the robustly left-wing Republican tradition, which was anti-clerical in all its forms, Catholic, Islamic, or whatever, seems to make an exception all the time for Muslims. Possibly because I think they've conned themselves that Muslims are always the oppressed and they are the European oppressors.
Yeah, I think it's actually something else. I think it's fear. I think terrorism works.
I think fear works as well. I think
terrorism is an incredible industry. You in your book mentioned there's a term privateer, which is a version of pirate. Perhaps you can parse out the difference between privateer and pirate. But the North African coast was filled with privateers, and I assume pirates as well. But terrorism. I'm not sure whether which term, whether it's pirating or privateering, but terrorism is an incredible industry. I mean, Yasser Arafat died a billionaire. He was an engineer by trade. I'm not sure what type or how good. I'm not sure what engineering he wound up doing aside from engineering this organization, but grew up in Cairo or whatever, and he died a billionaire without really having made the iPhone or Tesla or anything like that. I think there's a lot to be done. It's a very simple, similar aspect to how things operated perhaps in the Ottoman Empire and elsewhere, where people have to pay. They have to pay I suppose Tony Soprano does the same thing. There's there's a nice store you got here, it'd be a shame if the windows were broken tomorrow. And I think there's I'm not sure what the word for that is, racketeering or something like that. But it becomes forceful, and if you can't have the police operate in the banlieue and other no-go zones throughout Europe, under different not French titles, what do you have? I mean, you kind of go back to the concept of the Hanseatic League, which came about, kind of brought its own police force so they could enforce trade and have places where people could go without being robbed and so forth. I mean, it seems like an devolution of society we're seeing simultaneously.
Can we spin away from Islam to talk about places in France which are ungovernable, the banlieue which are ungovernable, which is kind of, I think, part of this story as well. And what I mean by that, over the past year, I've spent a lot of time in Marseille. And in particular, I've been working in the Quartier Nord of Marseille, which are the banlieue, which are about a third of the city, and which effectively are a kind of lieu de non-droit for the police. The Republic cannot operate in the Quartier Nord. Last year, 47 people were killed, shot dead in the Quartier Nord, which is unprecedented in European terms for that kind of thing. And the big story is whether the banlieue of Marseille are becoming a kind of narco city on the Mexican model. Now, what's interesting about that to me is that that's a story to do with immigration, urbanism, organized crime, but not Islam, actually. And probably the most dangerous part of France, Islamism doesn't have a presence because the gangsters outgun them. They won't let them operate. So Islamism is a sort of marginal presence in a place like the Quartier Nord. So I don't know what that's telling me, but it's telling me that that something is. This is what I find difficult to explain often to Anglo-American readers, is that there are two worlds in France, and the two worlds are growing increasingly separate. And moving away from political theory and history and so on, just at the very visceral level, the world of the banlieue, which are not all one thing, let's say, some of them are different from each other, but there is a kind of mainstream France and a non-mainstream France, and the two are very much at odds with each other. And whoever governs France at the moment, and even the RN, I don't think they've got the rhetoric, but I don't think they fully understand. Well, they might not understand it, but I don't think they've got the answer to these difficulties.
Well, so I guess we are kind of veering into the current French politics. I'm not even sure the name of Macron's party, but it was sui generis. Didn't he just kind of invent that? What were the parties pre-Macron, and why did he call a snap election? And what's the I don't know, the flow of this right now? He's still in office. His term is presidential, and this was, I guess, parliamentary. What happened with the second round? What was, Americans are curious. Was there cheating? There seemed like these are very, kind of almost inimical results between round one, round two. My understanding is not cheating per se; it was more gamesmanship. We used to play this game, Diplomacy, back in college, and it was a weird game because it'd take all day, and people had to, make these little conclaves, and they would backstab each other and form coalitions and whatnot. My understanding is that 200 potential representatives backed out of districts where the left and the center were fighting each other. So it was a little bit of quid pro quo. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. What happens, and if the left in fact kind of takes charge, whatever, how does that differ from the right taking charge versus the center? I mean, I suppose you have three choices here.
Well, I do think this election was won with gamesmanship. There's no doubt on an unprecedented level, actually. And I think one of the consequences of that is that fuels the narrative of victimhood that people on the RN or voters for the RN feel. A lot of angry RN voters out there who feel they've been cheated, they feel they've been tricked. That's the language I've been hearing. And then they say, well, you know, we've been cheated, we've been tricked. Is this a democracy? Because we can never win. We can never win. And the people who are in power, the coalition, the leftist coalitions, they're homogenous to the extent that they tend to be urban, that they tend to be university lecturers, that they tend to be the educated professionals, they tend to be the bobo classes. And there you come across, I think, one thing we haven't really touched on at the moment, we talked about Islamism, we've talked about immigration, is the internal class conflict in France between the I wouldn't say what was the working class, I'd say what is the working class, but the working class has been marginalized from the center of French political life. And there's no better example of that than Emmanuel Macron, whose party represents no one much more than anyone but himself, and whose victories have been constructed out of a fear of the evil RN fascists. But actually, there's nothing there. And I remember in 2017, when he first came to power, I did an interview with a very eminent social scientist in Paris, and he said to me, well, you know, this is very dangerous because what's going to happen is Macron will fail. He will fail because there's no political home, there's no political tribe, there's no political family. And when he fails, there will be a generation or several generations which will be politically homeless. That's happened. And the people who have been politically homeless feel abandoned, and they've been gravitating towards the RN. And the right, the left in France, I think quite simply, are just engineers of chaos at the moment. And that's a situation that it does nobody any good.
You live in Paris?
Yeah, southern Paris.
So I assume you don't live in one of the banlieues.
I live in an area called, I've just been doing some research this afternoon. It's an area called Pernetti, and it's within central Paris, but it touches on the banlieue. So you've got a kind of mixed population. There's a cité literally about 500 yards away. Yet where I'm sitting now in my flat, it's still quite sort of mixture of working class and sort of bobo gentrification. So it's a very hybrid area. Interesting.
Yeah. When you say cité, you mean what? Like is that a housing project or what?
Housing project? Yeah.
Because we have the Ile de la Cité, and
that sounds different, doesn't it?
In your book, you bring up the terminology of cité, how it I guess started kind of as a fortress and moved out from that. I was in Paris and France not that long ago, and I have an American expat friend there, and he was saying that he lives in a western suburb, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, a beautiful town, and in his apartment, he says, I'm probably a majority, what we would call majority minority. A lot of African expats there and so forth. And he's treated only civilly. He says that people are hugely polite, and he never has any kind of racial, ethnic, whatever issues going on. But that's I assume that's more by class than by color. And on some level, is the banlieue part kind of like a failure of integration of these other, we'll say of the others, of these young kids or whatever? Is there kind of a race issue? Is it an education issue? Is it an economic issue that causes the fertile soil for the Salafist and other kind of more, Al-Qaeda-ish ideas to take root?
Well, like your friend, I have never been treated anything but civilly in this district. I've lived here for 20 years. I love it. I mean, it's an area which has seen waves of 20th century immigration from Africa, from Eastern Europe, from North Africa. It was originally a very Portuguese, very Catalan area. I go outside my door and I'll hear about sort of 4 or 5 different languages. And I don't want to be too sort of Pollyanna-ish about this, but it actually works really well. I really like it. But I do think it's a little kind of utopian enclave that for everything that works well here, that all the problems are out there as well. And the problems that are out there as well, they're all to do with everything you said about sort of the economics, social exclusion, and so on, but also to do with things like infrastructure, urbanism, and then we have the mix of ideas that that could take people on the journey towards Islamism or towards crime, either way. But whichever way you look at it, you've got the danger of what Alan Finkielkraut calls the Lebanization of France, which means that you don't have right versus left. You have a whole load of different factions which have no interest in common,
right?
And who are living in a kind of forever war, and that sounds very bleak, but that's kind of how I feel very often. That's where we're heading or where we are.
Yeah, Lebanon's an interesting place. I mean, people forget, or maybe they didn't know in the first place, that Lebanon was a predominantly Christian country. I guess not, maybe just only 2 generations ago. They have, I guess, encoded or enshrined having, the 3 top leaders come from different ethnicities on purpose. There has to be like a Maronite, I don't know, we'll call it president. There has to be a Muslim prime minister. There has to be Druze. I forget what the other one would be. Let's say minister of the treasury, whatever. There has to be. They can only be from that group. But Lebanon, again, I think those, for better, for worse, or for worse, from Islam tend to be better at the terror part, and they've kind of crowded out the Maronites, and so demographically they wind up taking the forefront over time. And so I think Lebanon seen is mostly a Muslim country. Obviously, Hezbollah has free reign to do what it wants, and it's I think perhaps stronger than the Lebanese army itself. And so you get this, the Lebanonization of Lebanon is actually reaching a second order of magnitude. They're Lebanonizing Lebanon because again, Hezbollah has really taken over at least southern Lebanon, and the country itself falls under sway of Syria. Under Hezbollah, it doesn't get to be a country per se. I mean, I know people are still living and breathing there, but there's seems to be a forgetting or a lack of attention of those type of crimes. And that kind of like bring me to my final point, which is the obvious terminology of the French Intifada. I think has there right in the title events that happen in Israel and / Palestine, if you will. Which is clearly a crucible currently for this, and it's and what does it say, about the problem writ large? I listened. I mean, there's so much going on, and we have so much access. Unlike, say, 2 or 3 generations ago, we can kind of instantly see what people think and say from foreign places. I can listen to radical imams in 30 seconds after leaving this call. But people pretty much say, well, the Jews first, we'll get rid of the Jews and then the Christians. Do we take people at their face value? And how did that aspect play out? And the thing that really struck me in part about your book is the kind of brutality, the burning people alive, the beheading that happened during the Algerian war to intimidate the French.
Well. The French Intifada, the title didn't come to me. It was there in 2005 during the massive riots that took place all through France in 2005. And the word Intifada was being used by the people who were rioting, who were revolting against the police, because at that time, and still now, there was a conflation between what happens in the Middle East, what happens in Gaza and the West Bank, and what happens in the Banlieue in France. The population, the predominantly North African population here, see themselves aligned with the Palestinians, see the French state as the oppressors, as the Israelis are the oppressors of the Palestinians. It's a very easy model to follow. And if I walk out of my flat 500 yards down the road, before I get to the Cité, there's a wall that says free Palestine, and you cross that wall, and that's what everyone will believe. Now, very obviously, that's a very dangerous place to be a Jew at the moment. And one of the things that I think has been very much overlooked, I think, is the way that there's a new form of anti-Semitism in France, which is a very old part of French history, French culture, which comes from the North African population. The other day, as an example, I was walking down near the Cité, and there were two young Arabs, boy and a girl, arguing over money, coming to some kind of dispute. And the girl said to the boy, t'es pire que Nupin. You're worse than a Yid. Now, Yupan is a word that belongs to the 1930s. So I thought, that's kind of interesting. That's been resurrected in the 2020s. And then the second thing she says to him, she shouted at him, she said, t'es pire qu'un Israeli. You're worse than an Israeli. And you can see how Yupan to Israeli, it becomes a kind of discourse of hatred for this people, the Jews, who possibly they've never even met. So it brings us back to, I hate to use the word paradigm, but in the minds of these kids, there is a paradigm that the West is oppressing the East in Palestine, and the same model is happening here in France. Of course, it's all wrong, it's all untrue, but that's the way the imagination works of these people, and that's where the political danger comes from.
True enough. Yeah, no, it's an amazing thing. It's kind of like bite the hand that feeds you. You come to France, you live in France, you get to wear what you want, you get to go where you want, and people will have left Morocco, they will have left Algeria, whatever, and don't go back, and yet somehow those places models would be the ones that you'd want to put on top. That I have a friend I've interviewed here, Potkin Azamer in UK, and he's an Irani expat, and he left, shortly after the Shah fell, and he goes to some of these rallies and he says, "Free Gaza from Hamas." There doesn't seem to be any of the, understanding that, sure, okay, fine. Let's say you did want Palestine. Under which aegis would you want it? Like, do you want Hamas? Is that what it is? I mean, everyone seems to have the Palestinian flag, and nobody's really flying, or some people do, but for the most part, these rallies don't show the Hamas flag, which is not necessarily the Palestinian flag. It looks more like, an Al-Qaeda flag, it doesn't seem as if any of the sensibilities of liberty, égalité, and fraternité have transmitted into these rallies. You would not want to be, the gays for Palestine. You would not want to be gay in Palestine. Any of these ethnicities. I mean, the Gaza and a fair amount of the Arab world do not have diversity. That you cannot necessarily. I mean, it depends where it is. Vast place, but you can't necessarily have your political opinions. You can't necessarily be a professor following your muse and seeing where history lays and expect to, come back home with your body parts intact.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very obvious, isn't it? I mean, to support Hamas is to support a theocratic, neo-fascist, murderous organization. Is that what you really want? Is that what freedom represents? And that's the contradiction, isn't it? So on the one hand, you've got like the left in the West who sort of thinking in terms of post-colonial theory, decolonization and so on, and see the oppressor, the oppressed, this very simplistic model, In the Muslim world, I think it's much more, it's different as well. And I do understand it emotionally. Going back to what we were talking about before, the ummah, the concept of the universality of Islam. My Moroccan friends, universally, well, all of them, that's what I mean, will all be sympathetic towards Palestine. Not necessarily to mass, but they're guardedly towards the link between, I don't know, the bridge between the two. Because they feel it, because they're part of that family. And feeling sometimes, particularly as any family therapist will tell you, always supersedes reason in a family situation. And I think that's what it is.
Well, wonderful. I think we're kind of rounding out the hour here. So I'm going to give you a little bit of runway to give us final thoughts. And I'll see if I can pull up your book so people can find it. So tell us what are your words and advice for people?
With regards to this issue, try and think as clearly and as rationally as you can. And I'm advocating this, I think, from a left-wing position, not because I'm virtue signaling that I'm a nice person and a left-wing person, but because I think one of the problems here is the left has never been robust enough in terms of, talking about these problems, Islam, crime, immigration, rationally. But if, like me, you come from a working class background, I come from a working class background in Liverpool from the 1960s, I don't see what any of this benefits ordinary working class people in Europe, just very simply. And I think we've drifted away from a left which I understood as being about labour and organisation and social rights and so on, all of which are in fact Christian ethics in some ways. Certainly human rights are, even if they're in a very secular form, into this kind of fantasy post-colonial discourse of the oppressor and the oppressed, which is a kind of mask which blinds you to actually some of the real problems. And if you don't see the real problems, then you'll not be able to solve them.
Yeah. The funny thing about the immigration argument here is that our Democrat Party, ostensibly party of the workers, has disenfranchised our own workers by bringing in people who are willing to work for less. And it's kind of a funny thing that Donald Trump seems to have a higher blue collar vote than the Democrats do. Historically, the bastion of the Democrats and blue collar working class, that is. And it just seems as well that there's kind of a second aspect to this, which is that a lot of these countries from which people immigrate can't be fixed. And there's not really the effort to make those places and to find the formula that brought success. I mean, the West or the colonial powers, I mean, how did they get to be on top? I think that's ignored. And some of the fault lines, are not addressed really in the Islamic world. And there's no real force or power to put back, no lens put back to those places that would want to make them better and have them compete in the category of ideas. And a lot of places are happy to, in the kind of the, Shiite, seventh, what is it? I think the hidden imam, whatever, kind of the sensibility that this life doesn't matter, and only the next life matters. They're willing to impoverish themselves for the ummah, for the greater sake of religious solidarity. And this becomes kind of, kind of capitalism versus religion, which is a tough battle. And sword holding religion. So I think you bring up really interesting topics, and I recommend people follow you and look at your book. I have it here. It is the French Intifada. I'm sure they can find this on Amazon or elsewhere and look into it. I found it illuminating, and you bring a lot of knowledge to bear on this topic, and it's fascinating. I think it's incredibly timely. My time in France, I was thinking about actually for some reason it came to me Charles de Gaulle and Donald Trump. People are kind of inured they're kind of taught not to like Donald Trump. But how different was Charles de Gaulle, aside from the Algerian aspect? How different was de Gaulle? De Gaulle, I think, wanted to make France great, and almost literally his name as a as a French synonym. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it was kind of like the tall man, the big man, the man who embodies the country and has some identity for France. I don't know if you want to touch on that topic lastly before we go, but clearly it was a break. I mean, I there are people still in France, I guess, who don't refer to Charles de Gaulle Airport as such. There's a lot of people call it Hussey or something for the town. I don't know if you can maybe touch on my little quasi epiphany.
I'm very wary of the grand homme version of history, because I think that's a big part of French political culture as well. So you've got Napoleon, you've got de Gaulle, you've got the great man who comes in and saves France. But you see, what it leads to is the little man who throws a hand grenade under all of France, which is Emmanuel Macron, who thinks he's in that tradition and really isn't. And I think it's a dangerous lure for French politicians. They're all attracted to it, the idea of la gloire, the great romantic savior of France. But really, de Gaulle, his legacy, he's a great man, but his legacy is out there. Napoleon, he's still there. World historical figures, very suspicious of them. I'd rather just get the job done.
All right, lovely. Well, I'm going to leave with a quick self-promotion here. People want to help support this podcast. They can go buy my book. It's called Overturning Zika. It has nothing to do with anything we've talked about today. It's the pandemic that never was. 2015, 2016, Brazil, Zika apparently causing microcephaly. It has completely disappeared. It's off the news. That makes it kind of a tougher sell for my book, but it doesn't change the topic, which was that kind of misconception and bad science went into what became a panic and a pandemic, and perhaps in some ways foreshadowing what we saw with COVID, with liberties taken away. It was a much smaller scale. There were military on the street in Brazil, 250,000, and became kind of a nationalist cause to save the government of Dilma Rousseff. But it's an oddity because science, quote unquote, our establishment scientists, WHO, at CDC, and all the scientific institutions, everyone, they refuse to see the emperor's new clothes, the absence of his clothes, and it's an incredible story that I didn't know I was going to be writing about. But in 2019, before COVID, came upon this, and I'd heard this big pandemic. Like, what happened to it? Where did it go? Anyway, total sideline to this topic, but I'm honored that you came on my show, and I recommend people follow your pieces. You were in The Guardian recently, and you write elsewhere, so I'll try to list some of those in the follow-ups to this post.
Well, thanks very much, Randall. It was a very stimulating conversation. It's nice to be able to. I do a lot of work for the BBC and other media as well, so it's nice to have the. It was always very sort of truncated, so it's nice to have the space to explore topics properly. That's what I'd like to do.
So do you have a web page, or how can people follow you?
I don't. I'm an anonymous, invisible spectator to French life.
All right. Well, lovely. Thank you so much, Professor. I appreciate your being here.